Good morning and thank you for coming in. My name is Coach Flack, as somebody mentioned, and I was certified as a mediator back in 2004. It's been a little while. Every time I think about that, I can't believe the amount of time has passed. But in any event, it's been one hell of a trip and a nice exercise of mental genius on many people's part. So, what I've got for you is a little outline and it's done in what you might call ordinary language that we would speak, and flowers have not been put in there. We'll walk through that, give you some mindsets and the process. If you got questions, don't hesitate to ask. The questions create items of interest to other people, and we like to address those if we possibly can. And at the end, we got some cases that I'll mention, and we'll draw out of those cases the importance of having a caucus and what we learned from those cases had we not had the caucus. I think cases are extremely crucial. So I'll just pass these outlines around. Everybody good? Okay, one of the things I think is really crucial in terms of any type of mediation process is that we remember some basic things. And what I've had noted for you there is the idea of reminder. This is a common statement. People like to vent, but I found that if you don't let the people vent, your process of mediation is either going to come to a screeching halt, or you're going to have people that are emotionally involved to the point where you don't know what's going to happen. I've been in many of those situations where sometimes you think the parties are going to come across the desk of each other, and you definitely don't want that. It requires a little bit of what I refer to as being patient. Even though you may think that the amount of language, the ideas, the emotion in that is not necessary, you've got to let them feel that they have their day. If they don't have their day, they're just not going to cooperate with you. And the irony to all that is that if you do that, what eventually happens is they get those emotions out, and after they get those emotions out, it makes your ability to kind of exchange ideas much, much easier. And I think until you get to that point, you'll be struggling back and forth about trying to get them to think about how you want to accomplish what you want to accomplish, etc. So just by way of looking at one of the reminders, we're saying, let the people vent, have some patience whether you think that makes sense or not. And that's oftentimes a sub-question. You might not think that that makes sense. You also may have a group in your mediation where it's a family, as an example, and they're arguing over various things as it pertains to an estate, and they can't agree amongst themselves, so let alone is that going to help you if you don't let them vent and you don't observe them, which we'll mention a little bit later. But you've got to do that. That's my personal opinion. You've got to let them vent. It makes everything work out much, much faster. Emotional build-up between the parties, yes, you see that quite often. That ties in with the venting process, because if you can identify that this is an emotional group, you need to get those emotions tapered down. Because without that, again, you don't have the ability, because they'll just blank you out. So if you're being blanked out, your process of resolving your particular case is going to be very, very difficult. And you'll string it out for a much lengthier period of time. So in that mindset, make sure that you do observe the emotionalism that exists between the parties. Caucus is a tool to reach an agreement. It's probably the most important tool in the toolbox that we have. I think, as somebody alluded to here earlier, you regret not having done it. And other situations that I've been in, I'm so glad I did it, because they came up with situations and items that you would have never thought were going to be part of the process. So we got a case that I'm going to share with you that particular scenario had to take place. But it is the most important tool in my mind. You're the psychologist. You need to read your people. Your people, meaning the parties that come in to mediate. You need to make sure that you get some fix on what those people are thinking and where you think they might be going once the process begins. Because if you don't have that relevance in your mind, again, you're going to lose focus, they're going to lose focus. So keeping that in perspective is a crucial item. Be the psychologist, read the people. people reveal more when they know that we as mediators keep everything that they say in confidence. I can't believe how much relief the parties express, either directly or indirectly, when they know that we are not going to be broadcasting anything that they can find in us in the caucus environment. And this has always been the key part of the caucus, letting them know and reinforcing the idea is confidential, because they happen to be at that moment saying to themselves, but they didn't tell you this, they didn't tell you that. And you begin to see the emotionalism pop up again, but it's a little bit different version than what you saw in the very beginning. So again, the aspect of letting them know that this is a confidential process is crucial. Now, you will hear me say this again at a later point, but the idea that even though it's confidential, you will be able to, or might want to, tell the people, ask the people, would you mind if we shared this with the other party? And sometimes they'll say yes, and sometimes they'll say no. And it really becomes an asset to your process if you get them to say yes, because what you're doing is you're cutting down the time frame involved with going back and forth after the caucus, or even more so during the caucus. So I would suggest that that be the case. Listen carefully to what the people are saying. So often we have a tendency to get distracted because we think they're talking nonsense. We think they're talking off the wall, or they're talking about something totally out of the issue at hand. And again, that goes back to this emotionalism. The emotionalism basically is satisfying the idea that, well, he hit me first, so I'm going to hit him back. No, you got to watch for that, because you might have to jump in as a mediator and kind of curtail that emotionalism. It just can lead to things that are out of control. But at the same time, get back to the main purpose, because these people sometimes have come in with a loaded gun in their mind, meaning, and you need to get them to discharge that, but in a way that is going to be practical and providing you with information and material that you can solve the dilemma, or hopefully you can solve the dilemma. One of the things that I also found that was intriguing in mediation is that the parties sometimes lack communication between themselves. Last case I was involved in, Susan was there, the parties hadn't talked to themselves. And that makes your ability to solve this issue much more difficult. And if you pick up on the idea that they haven't talked to themselves or talked between themselves at any point in time about the problem, then again, we're stretching it out and we're making it much more difficult to resolve. We get a lot of, in the civil cases, we get a lot of attorneys that are participating with their clients. And I find that with the attorneys, they don't sometimes talk to their clients. And you really, I pulled one, I shouldn't talk this way. I pulled one in the sense that the last time I had a case, I actually got to the point where I said, we need to get the attorneys into a caucus. And so I basically asked the parties if they minded if we did that, and they had no objection. Well, the bottom line was, these two attorneys were trying to tell everybody in their clients what was in their mindset and what they think the client should have done. But in the interim, they hadn't talked to each other, and by their own admission, they hadn't talked to each other. So I put them into a caucus, and I don't know what the end result was, because they, after a while, had to leave. But I'm sure that they got a little bit more out of it than they anticipated, because we really put the spotlight on the two counsel, because the clients were really depending upon the attorney. Normally, we don't let the attorneys run the show. But in this case, progress was coming to a stalemate in the sense that we couldn't go anywhere. And these attorneys were totally responsible, in my mind, for resolving this dilemma, because they knew what the facts were. They knew what the outcome should be, because the two parties virtually had no money between them. And they're coming in and asking for a mega fortune. Well, we know that's not going to happen if there's no money between the parties. So the attorneys needed to consult with their client, but until you got those two together to say, okay, here, this is what we can realistically resolve, and this is what we can realistically anticipate achieving. Again, that's using the attorneys. So at small claims, you don't get to use the attorneys or don't get experience using the attorneys, but we do in the civil cases. I want to throw a question out. Anybody in relation to the reminder type items?
I was going to ask, how do you, when it's appropriate in the mediation, reduce the emotionalism?
Well, the first thing I do is I let them vent. I find that even though it's a tedious process, once they vent, what they've done now is they've chilled a little bit. And if they've chilled, then they can participate with what we're trying to do. Otherwise, they're sitting there and they're still blaming their buddy across the table that, you know, yada, 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 he's no good. Because, or they did this to me, because. So if you let them vent, regardless of whether it makes sense or not, it's to your benefit as a mediator. Or at least I think so. I don't know if anybody has a different opinion. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned venting, and I totally support that. But what I realize is often I try to allow that to happen when they're together, and that just, then they start venting at each other, and venting in caucus makes a lot more sense, I think.
Well, you got to start someplace. And if you don't let them vent in the beginning of the mediation process, you're losing something in terms of where you might think you're going with the case. The caucus venting becomes a little bit different in terms of its forum. You've got just the select parties there, and if they're venting, it's because they've got this buildup of biasness behind themselves or something of that nature. The venting process becomes a little bit different, at least in my mind it does. So I want to get the venting out, at least initially, in the beginning of the mediation process. But you're absolutely right, you need to do it in the caucus because that's one of the crucial items in the caucus, is to let them get it out.
But you find if they vent early, they make the other person more hyper?
More often than not, that they just start, it just builds up, and then you say, okay, we got a caucus. That's my experience, usually. Sometimes it helps. If one party is a reasonably good listener, but yeah.
But both scenarios are well adhered to in the sense that if you try them both, you're going to have a lot more chance of success, I think. If you just limit it to caucus, then you're going to have a situation that it's just going to take you so much longer. At least that's my experience, exposure. Yes, that's very crucial. Yes, sir.
I had a question about the confidentiality of caucusing, and when do you reveal that?
In the very beginning, in the introduction, we have that checklist that we have to go through with respect to agreement to mediate, and in there it identifies the confidentiality aspect. So it's important for us to make sure we never miss that, number one, and number two, if we find that it's necessary, we repeat it during the process. And again, I'll repeat it during the caucus time, because it's a magic word that it's just totally ironic that that little word is so powerful, because people all of a sudden start to think a little bit different. I can tell him this because he won't tell the other party. And to them, that's more important than anything else. Or they've gone through and there's been some situations where they've had family assets that were being challenged by, let's say, foreign court building. And the kids had problems amongst themselves to begin with, let alone try to resolve the issue of sharing the assets. So you have to find these things out, and again, if you don't reinforce that confidentiality thing, you're just kind of making the process go a little bit longer and a little longer. But it doesn't hurt to use that term as often as you think it's necessary. And I make a practice of it to use it frequently if I find that that's necessary. Because they're not listening half the time. In the very beginning, when they're doing their vent process, they're not listening to what the hell you got to say. So it's worth repeating, It's one word, it's not that expensive. Somebody else has a question?
I was just going to share an observation that I can't believe all the cases I've been involved in where these people, one part or the other is venting, seriously venting. And if you just sit there as a mediator with your mouth shut and let it pursue its course, it winds out and they wind up with a settlement. And I'm amazed every time it happens. It just folds out that way. But you've got to be patient, make sure you control the process, but let them duke it out, have it out, and it works. It really does. But you have to have patience and not put your foot in it. You got to just sit back and let it take its course.
No, that's exactly right. I believe that firmly. That patience factor is, again, another very key word along with confidentiality.
Patience is key.
I think it's important, was not necessarily a caucus, that you establish the fact that the neutrality of the mediator. Oftentimes, the partners are trying to win over the mediators with their argument, and you have to make it quite clear that your neutrality and you're not going to help one side or the other. You're going to help them help themselves.
You're exactly right, and that's also part of the introduction that we give for the agreement to mediate process, is letting them know that very thought process. We basically tell them we're good for nothing. And that kind of registers the light bulb goes on. Oh, you're not getting paid? Oh, okay. No, we're not getting paid. We kind of like you all, so we'll be here to try to help you. Excellent thought process. Yes.
I actually like to let them vent early in the process when they're together. And then because two advantages I have. One, they're not supposed to interrupt each other at that point, so they can really go. And I do tell the other party, use the paper. If you disagree with something, write it down, so you can go back to listening. But I find then when I reframe it, and they've heard me reframe it, then later, if they want to grind that axe again, I can say, I understand that's important to you. I've captured it in my notes, so let's move forward. And they both get the hint, like, oh, she's not going to let me keep. Because otherwise, they can just keep jumping back on that bone, and it's tough, So the reframing for me, after they're venting, is really key to letting them know I heard them, and to letting them know that I'm not going to keep circling back to that.
That's an excellent point. I've experienced that many times, because in fact, I've heard that comment from the parties say, oh, they're not letting us get away with that. Or they paid attention that we've been here before. You're exactly right. That's an excellent point. Yes.
I have a question. Is it ever appropriate in a caucus to sort of coach a party? I was involved in a situation recently with Shannon, and the husband, once we'd been going for a while, the husband just kept like pouring gas on the fire. But eventually we were able to get done, but I thought for a minute, in a caucus, could I say to him, this isn't helping us. If you keep doing this, you might not get to where you want to be. So
Done that many times.
Okay.
Sometimes you just absolutely have to do that. I have an advantage, Susan has an advantage, and others do too. But we get into a lot of scenarios where there's a legal issue at hand. We can't talk about the legal issue, but we have to be sharp enough to be able to come around that legal issue and make questions that will get them to focus on what we need to point out, accomplish, go to, etc., without actually telling them this is the law. I think it's frustrating in many instances because we know basically this is the rule of law, and you're not going into court to convince the judge otherwise. It's black letter law, but we can't tell them that. So yes, you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And I do that frequently. I mean, if you get an emotional group, you've got to do that. Otherwise, you're just going to be there all day and all night. Yes.
Yeah, I think you've raised a good point, Joe, about having to be quiet about the legal issues sometimes. But to me, caucus can be an important time to do reality testing with people if they're really overly emotional. You know, sit them down separately and say, how do you think what you're doing right now is helping solve the problems here? And just to get them to take a look at that out of the presence of the other party can sometimes...
So I love the way you ask it as a question rather than making a statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always find if I have something that I really, really, really want to say, frame it into a question.
Yeah. Or even sometimes with some of the legal things, you say, just to say, how do you think a judge is going to react when you say that, or when you present that in that way?
I was thinking about how sometimes people had never talked to each other. Then one time I was a counselor in the court, and in domestic relations court, and a husband and wife came in, and they came in an hour early, and I was talking to somebody else, and I could feel the anger in the room. In fact, the anger was so intense that the secretary got up and left. She wouldn't even sit there with them. And I thought, well, I was trying to talk to this other person. I was trying to think about how in the world am I going to handle this? And I got out in the room, and they said, you know, we haven't talked to each other in 4 years, and we pretty much settled everything.
That happens, yeah. That happens more often than you think, for the simple reason they haven't talked to each other. Yes, very much so. Any others along the line? Yes.
Yeah, good question, and maybe there's a collective anecdotal evidence, but the difference between facilitating communication between the two parties, where it's you language versus they're looking at you saying she, he, is there any evidence that the tone of the conversation, the venting, is different if they're looking at you saying she, he, versus facing the client where there's direct communication? Because the psychology behind that, it seems to be different.
You'll see a different momentum, you might say, based upon which they're trying to do, whether it's to us as the mediators or to the other party. Once in a while, it'll happen that they'll talk to us, the mediators, when they really want to send that message across the table to the participating party. It's kind of like bouncing off that wall. So, but you could have done that. Again,
so you're saying in those situations, they're actually communicating to each other, whether there's eye contact or not, they're using you language. Is that what I'm hearing?
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And body language is really, really important to pay attention to. Yes, very much so.
I don't think you should force them to address each other, because if they're really heated, they need to go through you at first. You know, you might be setting up a real fight. And later you can say, you know, well, why don't you talk to them directly?
Right. Yeah, I didn't know if in that initial venting, the tone would carry over into the caucus, of the caucus venting, dependent on the method of the communication. So even if it is heightened with the you language, I wonder if that would allow more acute venting so that the caucus is a little bit more, I got my say out to the person, as opposed to just kind of using a triangle through the mediator. It's just an anecdotal question. I didn't know if anyone had experience with that.
No, you're absolutely right. It does change the momentum. It does change the presentation. One of the other things that's in the checklist of agreement to mediate is we have to tell them, or we do tell them, that while the other party is talking, you need to refrain from interfering. A lot of times you get these emotional parties involved and they don't want to listen to anybody, and they just want to vent, and you have to curtail that. And you constantly have to remind them in many instances, not all, but many instances, let the other party speak, let the other party speak. And eventually they get the message. And so then you can flip it to the other side of the table. And you just say, well, we've got them to let you talk, now you let them talk. But you have to do that. You sometimes have to be pretty blatant. The courtesy issues sometimes don't facilitate the outcome in a manner that you'd like to have. You just have to be blunt. As rough as that sounds. When to caucus? This is always the real question as to when to caucus. And one of the things I wrote down was when you don't know what else to do, you've exhausted your efforts. You've looked at the fact, you've listened to the facts, you've looked at many of the evidence that's been brought in and laid on the table. You are thinking along the case as it's presented, but you're stuck. You can't seem to get the parties to acknowledge each other. You can't seem to get the parties to agree on virtually anything. So the bottom line is that you have to think in your own mind, am I stuck? What else can I do? And most of the time, the conclusion you're going to come to is, I can't do anything more in this first study. So the only way you can break the ice then is to think about putting the parties into a caucus. And if you get them into the caucus, then again, it may be such that the whole environment changes. But until you get to that point, you're kind of spinning your wheels in many cases. And you just have to take actually say, we need to stop, let's have a caucus, and we'll do the caucus for each of the parties, and keep it in confidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the things we just mentioned. So if
And
you,
then what's your first question when you're in caucus?
well, that depends on the type of case.
I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. You tell me.
Well, I'm not gonna tell them I'm stuck. No. I gotta do my magic. And sometimes I think I'm a magician to begin with. But that's okay. Another one says, you suspect there's more to the story. I think this one is more of a dominant type of setting than anything else. If you've listened carefully as a mediator, you've observed carefully as a mediator, bottom line is you're going to say to yourself, common sense tells me I think there's more to the story. Not always. I've been fooled many times, but the other aspect is more common one. There's got to be more to the story. And the emotionalism that exists between the parties are such that they're not going to reveal it at that point in time. You really have to isolate them in their own right, their own environment, and you will get that out of them. And sometimes it's an amazing story. But I got a couple cases I'll share with you as to how that happened. You've reached an impasse and neither party will give in. At that point, you have to ask yourself, okay, is this an exercise in futility, or do I want to give it one more try? And oftentimes, what do you got to lose? Let's try the caucus. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You don't want to be ashamed to say, you need to take it to court. That's your right. We're not moving anyplace here today.
Surprisingly, sometimes, however, when you come to that conclusion and you start talking about the fact that you haven't been successful and it's going to go to court, this turns a light on and somebody says, well, maybe there's something else to be done. It's a matter of avoiding going to court. You may have given up a little too soon based upon what you're hearing from the parties.
You're absolutely right in that respect, but it also works the reciprocal. My other note in here is, and I'll jump to it, they are hell-bent on going before the judge. And you're not going to change their mind, at least not at that moment. We usually get to change it when we get into caucus, but until that time, that they're hell-bent to see the judge. They're usually operating under false impressions, false information, or misled aspects of the case. So again, you have to pay attention. You have to figure out, are we at an impasse? What do we do?
Most of the time, they want to see the judge because they think they're on the soundest ground legally. It's a legal question. And it's hard to get them to get off the legality of their claim as opposed to the practical resolution.
One of the things that happens to us in civil cases, we get court orders. And that is really good leverage to have, because all you have to do is remind the parties that the court did the order that you have in mediation, and we need to resolve this. And it will sink in. It takes a little bit of time, but it will sink in. Because if they go back to court and they tell the judge they didn't want to participate or we didn't get anything out of it, there's going to be a little Q&A to find out exactly what they did do. And that was the purpose the judge sent them there to begin with, was to resolve it, or resolve some aspect of it. Sometimes the court order doesn't outline a whole case. It just outlines or identifies one or 2 points that the judge would like to see resolved, because it's going to save the court a lot of time if they come back. But we have that for civil cases.
And another, sometimes, fortunately it doesn't happen very often, is that one of the parties is running the show. I mean, they've taken, they've got an idea, this is what it's going to be, this is how it's going to be decided. This is particularly true in some of the landlord-tenant trailer park cases, where they come in and they've got a stack of files and they want to get through them all today. And so they're just, here, sign this, And so they're abusing the process and abusing the other party. Unless you stop that.
Well, you got to remember, you're in control.
Well, this is where you're supposed to, this is where there's a contest between you and the other party as to who is controlling the process.
Well, that's your diplomacy skills at work. You have the floor, it's yours.
Yes, it's where I get to decide and tell them, you know,
You may have to be very blunt, shut up, sit down.
well, this guy was always, he was just horrible. And we had to finally tell him, you're not going to be, we won't let this go on. Don't come to us with any more of your cases.
Sure.
Go straight to court.
You
And
go
and the
straight-
magistrates are told us we
Yeah,
can.
go straight to court. Yeah, it's just,
Absolutely.
you really have you're not interested in this process.
Sure.
You're just using all of us here to get what you want.
Exactly. That's very well said, yes, exactly.
There was one time when somebody was, I was saying that because he was trying to force the person to agree before they even went into mediation. And I went in and I was just rattling about, you have to wait till mediation. And finally, I think there was an observer and the observer said to him, I know you're mad at Sally, but don't take it out on the other person.
Yeah, that happens too, I've seen that.
Yeah, he was the guy, I think, who would come in and say, we've settled these cases. And he just handed the forms to them. We've settled it all. And you had to fight to get, to unwind that.
Yeah. And caucus can help.
Pardon me?
Caucus can help.
Oh, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. And the worst thing that can happen is you get into another stalemate caucus. But you have to pick up on that and just say, okay, enough is enough. Take your problem to the court. You have that right, yes.
I have a question about caucus meetings. So if there's one person, one side that you want to sit down and caucus and set them straight, but I think you always want to caucus with both parties, but you have nothing to say to the other party, what do you do when you meet with them?
You mean if one doesn't say anything?
No, if you have a reason to caucus, and the reason to caucus is because one party is not behaving like they should, and you say, well, we're going to meet separately now, and we're going, you don't want to just meet with one and not the other, right? But you have nothing really to say to the other.
Well, you have to be shrewd enough to say, this is what we've done, this is where we think we are, even though the other party seems to be steadfast.
So just make up something.
Yeah, thank you. That's,
Well, one thing, Joseph, one thing that I've done sometimes is to, when you get with that second party, just to ask them, what's your reaction when you hear this other person saying this? And sometimes you can learn some things about their view of that whole situation that you didn't know before.
Yeah, or sometimes I'll just say, okay, I've checked in with the other person, now I'm going to check in with you, so how's it going? How's this process working for you? And sometimes you think you have nothing to say, and they burst into tears, and all this stuff comes out, because if there's a real imbalance.
yeah, to use the nickel dime word, you have to be creative.
But you do always want to meet with both.
Yes, the process wants you to make sure that you entitle both parties to a caucus without doing it for one party only, because somebody will accuse you of being biased. So whether you accomplish anything or you think you're going to accomplish anything, you got to do it to both sides. Yes.
One question that it's always there for me going into caucus is, well, is there anything you care to share that you didn't share when we were together?
Exactly, yeah. Excellent opening comment. And that'll usually lead to a parade of events. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So in that situation of a potential power imbalance in caucus, could you use the phrase, do you feel intimidated? Is that something an intimidator mediator language could use?
You mean intimidated by the other party?
Yeah, like the landlord-tenant situation we were talking about, where if one feels intimidated by the kind of the power party in caucus, could you use that question, that language in the question? Are you feeling intimidated?
By that time, you're going to have a sense for what's going on, and I wouldn't hesitate to use that type of language, because that's the only thing that's going to register. Nickel dime words will register. Sophisticated, polite language, PC, they're not going to register. They're not going to hear you. But words like that, they get the attention just real quickly.
If you could say it in an open-ended way,
Right.
not a yes or no question.
Got it.
I've said before, it's my job as the facilitator to balance the room. How are you doing? And they'll say, I'm intimidated, you can see what's happening. But it's a way of, by bringing up the balancing of the room, I think it gives them the in to express that themselves. And then I'll say, do you mean, you know, as we're talking, sometimes they don't want to put something on the table because they are intimidated. But in the caucus, you can say, do you want me to bring that up on your behalf, and exactly what you want me to say? And then I find it's interesting, then all of a sudden, oftentimes they'll say, no, I can do it myself, I've got this. And they feel, just because you saw it, you acknowledged it, they feel stronger. So.
Any other thoughts?
Just a quick, on emotions, especially when they're high, it can be uncomfortable, and I think there can be a tendency in mediators to just want to get to the solution, like the dollars and the agreement. So getting more comfortable with managing emotions is, I think, important. I find that just validating emotion sometimes is what's needed. You just say, I hear your blah, blah, blah. And I think a third party doing that can be just helpful by itself.
That's the empathy aspect of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question, it works frequent and it works often. Never hesitate to do that.
Yeah.
In fact, recommend doing that.
Right.
You see that it's necessary.
So sometimes that's what I default to. I'll just validate, in neutral language, each side, and I find that can kind of bring the level down a little.
Absolutely right.
And then just a quick experience that I ran into that I learned from, I was mediating a case, and just to speak to different styles of mediators. So my style is to like go the distance, I'll hang in there a long time. And other mediators maybe feel this is going nowhere, and they're just a different style. They want to sort of end the process. So one time I was with the mediator, and we were at an impasse, and I thought, boy, this is going to be tough. But I did suggest, I think it's time to caucus. And my co-mediator, with their style, just said, well, out loud, I don't see how that's going to help. And so that kind of like ended everything right there. So I guess what I learned is that support your other mediator. So if you're with somebody who maybe has a style that wants to like try a caucus, that I guess it's a mediator kind of relationship thing. Like try to be sensitive to if your co-mediator wants to give it a shot and you're thinking it's maybe not worthwhile, maybe give it a shot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because you never know, the co-mediator may just say the necessary thing that triggers whatever to happen.
Yeah.
So, yes, absolutely.
I guess because you never really know unless you try.
That's right.
Caucus, so
You got nothing
that's
to
my
lose.
style.
That's true.
You got nothing to lose and everything to gain.
Yeah.
I have a secret motive or motivation when I do these things, and I get to a point of impasse. I have to make a decision. I keep track of my cases, and I got an 80% win factor, or agreement factor, is another way to put it. So I don't want to pop that bubble. I just keep saying to myself, hey, let's try it. Because I like to keep that 80% thing.
But I like the way you say, if it's their decision to go to court, that's their decision. That's a successful mediation.
Yeah.
Initially, they may say that, and you let it go, because you don't know where the time is going to take you. But if they keep insisting, you'll pick up on the idea that, no, this is just for exercise of futility, and just excuse and go to court.
I'd just like to say one thing about your comment. I think the mediators can caucus. There's some discussion that the mediators should have among themselves, can go out and just kind of talk things over. Because in that case, I would have pressed to just have a caucus, just try it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
That happens a lot, too.
Yes.
Very much so. And it's a good initiative. Absolutely.
And you can either leave them in the same room or invite one out in the hall.
Yeah, it depends on your frequency of familiarization with your co-mediator. Sometimes parties have done it enough time to pretty much can read each other's thought process.
Right.
But in your comment, I totally agree. I've done that before. I've seen it happen. And it is a good help. Very good help.
Well, mediators are caucusing. The parties are sitting in the room settling the case.
That's very possible.
Yeah.
Everything is possible.
Yeah,
Right.
All I can think about, Tom, is like my brother and I are fighting. When my mom and dad would leave the room, we're like, oh, we're in trouble. We're like, uh-oh. They're working something out. Uh-oh.
The next head note refers to post-caucus facilitation to reach an agreement. At this point, you've gone into the caucus setting, you've explained to them the ground rules that need to be adhered to, and you're in search of whatever it is that can hopefully lead you to an outcome. You facilitate by using what's revealed in the caucus to merge the ideas, meaning that you've now heard both sides of the story. Your role at that point is take the information you got in the caucus of each side, each setting, and try to make something that will have uniformity of solution. Sometimes, again, you have to be very blunt about it. Another factor that helps you is when you ask if you've got permission to share that information, they'll have already spoke up and say, well, we'd be willing to settle for X. So it may be settled for X on one party's, X for Y on the other party. Now you have to make them mesh. And that's your role as a mediator. Once you've gotten into the caucus and you've concluded the caucus, whatever you gain during that process, you have to mesh. So if you're looking for something to accomplish, that's a crucial part, post-caucus. I already mentioned some parties give their okay to reveal the other side. During the caucus, the parties may reveal that they're ready to settle. This happens a lot. You have to pay attention and pick up on it, because they'll either do it in a way that says, yeah, I came here with the idea that I'd settle, or they'll start throwing out numbers, or they'll start saying, throwing out an idea that will lead to a settlement of some kind. But you need to pay attention, because this is the end result. You're at that point where something needs to be accomplished or has to happen. And the bottom line is that that is a key factor. Just knowing that that mindset is there and is exhibited during the caucus, you need to again mesh that and see if you can come to a solution. I wrote down here, I've got 4 cases that I like to use in the sense that this explains the value of the caucus. There's a car dealership parts, first case, again I'll abbreviate the case, but what had happened was a dealership came in, their manager or assistant manager, I'm not sure anymore which one he was, came in hell-bent, no way was he going to settle this case unless it was for this. And he just basically, all through the time period of pre-caucus, insisted that that was the mainstay. He was not going to move off dead center for no reason. And so you begin to think along the lines, okay, are we at a stalemate? And the answer to that became no, let's do the caucus. The beauty of this caucus was the other parties were a little bit uptight about the fact that they were being asked to pay for something they didn't think had been done with their vehicle. And so they asked the dealership party, do you have a list of the parts in your inventory or parts that you are alleging needs to be paid for? And he says, oh yeah, I got them. So he gave it to them. So while we were trying to get the dealership manager to figure out why he was being hell-bent on whatever, the other party during the caucus with the manager took the sheet, the printouts, and they started looking at the parts. And they said, wait a minute, these are not our GM parts, these are Chrysler parts, we think. So they came back in after we had done the caucus with the manager, and they said, can you go back and check with your parts department about these numbers? And the manager agreed to do that, and oh my God, you never saw somebody eat crow like this guy did. But they had charged him for Chrysler parts, and they had a GM car. and that wasn't their responsibility in any way, shape, or form. But I can still see this guy, the manager of the dealership, telling us, I come in here with the authority, I'm not moving off dead center, this is the way it's gonna be. And time and time and time again. And then when he had to reveal it, yeah, we got the wrong part. That kind of said it all. It was a good lesson, the value of the caucus in that case. One of my favorites is what I refer to as the honeybee case. We had two people that lived out on farmland, and one party was a farmer, the other guy across the street was a construction guy. And the construction guy's business had been kind of in a dwindling economic scenario. So he had excess equipment. He didn't want to sell it, he just wanted to store it. So he asked the neighboring farmer across the street if he could use his property to put these trucks and equipment over there, keep them out of the way during the time that he wasn't going to be using them. And the friendly farmer said, sure, I'm not bothered by it, I don't need that land right now, I'm not doing anything with it, on and on and on. So this evolved over a period of 2-3 years. And finally the farmer realized, he says, I want to take and put that excess property under a farming scenario, so that when I do the other part of the field, I can just incorporate that. So he asked the construction guy to move his equipment. The construction guy wouldn't do it. And so this created a scenario of, wait a minute, it's my property and you're not willing to get the construction equipment off of my property. Then there was allegations of, okay, you need to pay rent. Well, we didn't have an agreement for me to pay rent. I kept going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Well, we got into caucus, and we asked the construction guy what the hell was going on. And again, I'm going to short circuit the scenario. The construction guy's honey was not getting any honey. What does this mean? The farmer was a bee farmer on top of doing these fields. The construction guy's wife had been buying the honeybee honey from the farmer for a long, long time. And she was just totally in love with the honey that came from the farmer. But when the conflict developed, the farmer shut off the honey. Not going to be any sold to you. So she didn't have her honey one way or the other. Net result was we could settle the case if the farmer would agree to sell the construction guy some honey. Now think about it, we've been arguing economics and we've been arguing contracts, and we've gotten to the point where honey all of a sudden is an issue. And to make the case go away, he said, sure. And they settled on $80 for a 5-gallon drum, end of story.
The truck's still there?
The truck's still in the yard.
No trucks are without. But I thought that case was so cute. Totally out of oblivion to the solution.
Joe, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Backing up to when they're ready to settle, I've had this happen twice and it makes me wonder what I do wrong. Where they get back together and the one party goes, she said I should offer you $1,900. And I didn't. I've had it happen twice. And I try to be really careful with my language. You know, like, okay, is that a number that you're willing to put on the table when we get back together? You know. And one time I think he wasn't committed to the number, so he was trying to back out of it. And the other one, the guy was joking. He was just joking. He goes, she told me I had to give you $4,000. And I didn't. So how do you handle that? Like with the joke, I just went, come on. You know what I mean? And everybody laughed. But it's awkward. Because it feels like you've lost your bias in caucus.
To address your question, we go back to something earlier about the meshing. you have to be able to perceive, is this a serious situation, or are we just throwing dust in the air and hoping someone will settle?
With their numbers, you mean?
Exactly. And unless the parties have agreed to exchange information in the caucus, you kind of got a dilemma.
Right.
You now have to be creative as to how you get these amounts to be in the forefront so that you can reach whatever number is, or at least get close to it.
Right, and in both cases, they had agreed to put the number on the table themselves. In the one case, that was kind of an unusual case, so I just thought, okay, that was really an outlier. But then when it happened the second time, the guy was joking. I mean, I think he was trying to save face.
That's very possible.
And so, but how do you avoid, you know, I mean, you can't anticipate it, and then, or how do you manage it when it happens? Because then I think, oh, so do the other people think that I went into caucus and talked about their information? Do you know what I mean? It just really felt like it really jeopardized the confidentiality. Even though the confidentiality wasn't violated, it gave the impression that it was.
Well, again, what you have to be able to do is, in the other setting, is manipulate your mindset to those numbers the best possible way. You may not hit them on the head, but at least you plant the seed. And hopefully that seed will blossom and become a meeting of the minds in several minutes or whatever. You have to be creative and manipulate around it. It might not always work, but that's where you start. Lemon law case, another one that I love. You're not familiar with the lemon law case? Lemon law? In the state of Michigan, we have a lemon law, which is a statute that basically says that if you buy a new car or lease a new car, you're entitled to have it fixed or replaced under certain circumstances if the dealer can't fix it. In this particular case, the lessee hired an attorney to help him out. And what was not common knowledge was that the lemon law also states the attorneys are entitled to a fee. It doesn't say how much. Reasonable is always the key word. But what had happened was the Chrysler Corporation and the party that leased the car couldn't seem to get on the same path. And the lessee kept taking the car back, kept taking the car back, kept taking the car back, and they wouldn't, or didn't fix it. And one time he decided to do a follow-up on it and discovered that all they did was put it in the lot, let it set. Never did anything about it. So, again, simplifying it, the statute indicates that it must be the same repair that hasn't been accomplished. Or if it's taken too long. If it's taken them a year to fix it, that's also the basis of the argument to replace the vehicle. So this was a scenario where Chrysler Corporation sent their attorney in, and he was now hell-bent on saying, this is all we're going to settle for. And again, he was very firm in his behavior and his mindset, the whole 9 yards. And it took a couple of caucuses in that particular case. The whole outcome was such that the attorney for the lessee had run up a bill very high. And Chrysler Corporation knew that, and they weren't willing to pay that amount of money for attorney's fees. They basically said, we'll pay this much, that's it. Well, the long and short of it was, the lessee's attorney was not recommending a course of action for an outcome until it was decided by Chrysler Corporation after we did some browbeating. Give him X number of dollars towards attorney's fees. And just for the sake of a number, I'm going to say, give him his $10,000 out of a $15,000 bill. And that aspect of the case being revealed will pay the attorney $10,000 settle the case, because the attorney all of a sudden had a change of heart, encouraged his client to settle the case and get a new car. And so it worked out rather well, but it wasn't the issue of the car so much as it was the attorney fees were not going to be paid. The attorney wanted to be paid, otherwise he wasn't going to have his client cooperate. Just keep suing and suing and suing. So again, one of those things is hidden in the agenda when you're doing a caucus. Tow truck cases, this was my introduction in the very beginning, back in 2004, in small claims. We get these record drivers or tow truck drivers coming in and being challenged for the hauling the party's car away. And the bill would be, I don't remember the numbers per se, but the bill would be maybe $250, $300. And initially, as a rookie mediator, we tried to do our best efforts by saying, okay, tow truck driver, what's the deal here? And come to find out, if the tow truck driver picked up the car under permission basis, meaning that he got a call from, let's say, a landlord, where the landlord had a sign on his buildings that said cars will be towed away if, as long as they do that, they can charge $250, just for the sake of a number. And that's all that's going to happen. There's no way out of it. The tow truck driver has to pay all these different ordinance entities their share, because the statutes spell out how much goes to each one of the entities. So much to the city, so much to the tow truck driver, so much to this one, so much to that one. So he couldn't dip in his pocket unless he was going to pay everything to those people. And he wasn't willing to do that. His share of it was the smaller portion. So that was one of those cases where the statutory language was such that it made it miserable for anybody that was going to mediate the case, because there was just no leeway. Even in good intent, there was just no leeway. But I always had that stick in the back of my mind. That's why caucus is a valuable scenario to be involved in, because you find out whether it's relevant, irrelevant, but you find them out. Then you know where you can go after that. That kind of in a nutshell is some of the things that come to mind when we do mediation and we do the caucus, and what we do with the information we get in the caucuses per se. Yes?
I kind of hope to ask you about, because of your experiences. Recently, I've had a couple of cases in small claims that involved some very obvious scams on the part of the plaintiffs, finding a loophole in the law where they were making claims against a retailer for some pricing, mismarking of pricing in the statute which provides some relief. And because of the changing in merchandising operations, using the self-checkout procedure rather than going through the cashier, they were able to create multiple numbers of transactions at the same time for small amounts of money, and created under the statute, theoretically, a claim for several $1,000s, although limited by the small claims statute of $5,500 or $6,000. And the merchants were willing to actually cooperate with this scam by falling back on some language in the statute that called for a limitation of not more than $250 per transaction. Although the anticipation under the statute was that the cashier would be controlling the transaction, as opposed to the self-checkout where you can create multiple transactions just simply by paying for each item as you went along and getting receipts for each item. My concern is I was actually a party to a settlement that provided for some relief for the scammers in mediation, and I really wasn't comfortable with the idea that, that a part of the legal system was being used here and I was being a part of that scam, as opposed to having the right to say, hey, this is a scam, you should get out of here. I didn't have the right to do that, but I had my name on a mediation settlement that accommodated the scammers. Have you ever had an experience like that?
No, I haven't. But if I'm listening carefully to what you say, there's statutory language that controls it.
Well, the statutory language was very ambiguous because it said that maximum of $250 per transaction. And the legal question was, what constitutes a transaction? Is it the 39 receipts that they generated at the self-help? a self-service, as opposed to a cashier who's handling a transaction for that day.
Well, same principle, because the effect of the law, and I understand it's been a while since I looked at it, but the cashier, that transaction's not complete until she obviously sells it, closes out the particular trade. That's what you're
Well, what
doing with
happened
the
is
self-serve.
this was, it happened to be candy bars, so were mispriced at $1.50 rather than
The
$1.
same candy bar?
Candy bars, yeah.
Same one or
The
different?
same candy bar, but 39 candy bars with the checkout and claiming the $1, either the price differential or not less than $1 as a penalty for mislabeling of the pricing on it. So the question was, normally if a cashier gets it, you ring it up on the cashier, just, oh, well, you rang it up at $1.50, it's only $1. The cashier at that point would probably change the pricing on the next 38 items as they're being processed.
That's true, but the claim doesn't come into effect until the transaction's been closed. So you've got to go through that cashier and have total conclusion of your transaction before the statute kicks in. Because oftentimes what will happen is, again, I don't know if you remember that statute? Consumer statute? Otherwise, if you mention it to the cashier before the finalizing of the transaction, you're not entitled to the statutory benefit.
And that would be fine, except that is, by checking yourself out, you actually pay for each candy bar before you move on to the next one. So you end up with 39 receipts showing the price discrepancy. And that was the ambiguity of the claim, which made it pretty obvious it was a scam.
So isn't the question for mediation, what do you as a mediator
Well,
do
the
when the
question-
parties come up with an
The
agreement
problem
that you
was
think
is
is improper or illegal?
The defendant, in this case, the retailer,
Yeah.
fell back on the interpretation of the transaction, limitation $250 transaction, and not in caucus, but in reality, I pointed out that it's not for me to give you a legal opinion here. If you want to, if the interpretation will be the court will make an interpretation here, but the party wanted the $250 minimum, so they agreed to an agreement to get the $250 rather than going to court.
I wonder if you could have ended that by saying, I think you need to go to court.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and if the retailer said, I want to go to court, I would have been more than happy to let them pursue it. The retailer and the representative of the retailer was willing to pay the $250 just to wrap it up at that point.
Yeah, because it's going to cost the retailer $500 to $1,000 to take it to court.
And you know, and not every settlement we've been a party of really was fair and equitable, but we made our best effort. In this case, this was neither fair nor equitable, it was a scam.
Well, at least you know you've been a party to it.
Right.
We're both confused. Any other thoughts?
These exercise on that. One, I think it's up to the retailer to, I mean, they're the one that was hurt. And they're probably worried about this happening again and stuff like that. So they either need to take it to court or to take it, to get the law changed to the SAO. The other thing is, in the mediation agreement, there's something about, I guess it doesn't say you can terminate, it just is the confident, well, it talks about cases of abuse, that you're not required, that you can't testify and that you could break confidentiality. I don't know if that could, if you could say that this is a case of abuse and that I'm not going to continue mediation.
Or illegal activity, I think that's something else.
Well, I don't think it says that in the mediation.
No.
The other one that sometimes accelerates small claims decisions in the 15th district court is one of the parties says, I'd like to wrap this up because my parking meter is running.
Yes.
My closing comment is that we've kind of shared the ritualistic process, but at the very end, I think there's always a key statement that should be addressed, and that is, what would it take for you to settle this case? And oftentimes that changes the whole momentum, because they really hadn't been thinking about that in a direct basis. But using that statement, what would it take? Especially if you got parties that are losing money in wages or losing money in terms of time involved with this case, all other kinds of economic issues, this becomes a key phrase. And oftentimes results in much more expedited settlement. I hope we answered some of your questions or many of your questions. I hope you see the trend in terms of caucus and its value. I believe it's extremely valuable and never hesitate to use it. The worst thing that can happen is you terminate the caucus in 10 minutes. Send it to court.
What percentage of your cases roughly are go to caucus that you facilitate?
Caucus cases,
You mentioned that you've got an 80% success rate in mediation. So what's the number one reason for that? What do you attribute to it?
I'm good.
Is there any single thing about the way you approach a case, the way you deal with the people that you think is a major contributor to that success rate?
Yeah, basically everything I outlined to you today are facets that I use, some more so than others. I go back to the very beginning of the venting process. Let them vent, let them get it out of their system. Then you have to use your ingenuity to take it from there. The caucus sessions, I know, caucus sessions are basically responsible for a very, very, very high percentage. Otherwise, you become a party to a stalemate. Many of the cases, there's not uncommon, I'll say, fine, take it to court, because I can see we're not going anyplace caucus or no caucus. So you have to make a judgment.
And so the other 20% were also successful. Right? Successful mediations because they did what they wanted to do. And they went to court. I'm speaking up for Glenda, who wants to make sure that we don't push people to make agreements when they really don't want to.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
No, we've had some people, mediators, who have very high success rates, but you ever sit in, they're not mediating. Yeah, it's.
They're dictating?
Well, yeah, it's a, what's that form of mediation you can opt to go into? It's where you want the mediator to make a decision.
Arbitration.
Well,
Evaluative?
Yeah, you evaluate and you say, this is what you're going to get, you know, and people move on, you know. So I think there's different styles. I think sometimes that I find that I have to restrain myself from going into a caucus too soon, because it hasn't, mediation is sort of like cooking, you know, it takes a certain amount of time for these parties and the issues to get to a point where, now it's edible, you know. But I think a mediator, if you're going to be true to the profession, and that is let the parties, you know, this is the parties' show, and you're just kind of making certain that you go through the necessary steps. But I think there's a real temptation sometimes, and I understand it. I mean, especially when you have a limited amount of time for the mediation, you know. You're going to have to be out of here.
Yeah, right. No, I think that's really an important comment. I was thinking back that when I take my basic mediation training, when they were talking about caucus, one of the things they said was, when all your instincts are screaming, caucus, let's caucus, step back and wait a few more minutes before you do it, because something else may happen.
It's true. And I think in Al's case too, I brought her up with Zin and Zubeda, who I always feel is the grand arbiter of all questions in mediation. I said, what do you do when you've got parties who are agreeing to something that's not fair to one of them? And she says, that's not your business.
That's right.
It's not your business. They want to do it, and they've been apprised of.
Remember, your role is a facilitator.
Yeah.
It's not settle the case, it's a facilitator.
Yeah.
So, Zina's right, I mean, not your problem.
Especially in divorce cases where there's a settlement that's proposed, and usually it's the wife who said, no, I'll take it. And I'm thinking, that's a bad deal, but she's thinking way down the line. She said, I may be divorcing this guy, but I'm gonna have to, we have kids, and we're gonna continue to have issues come up with mediation. I don't want to go out of your enemies again. So, you never know. You never know.
I think it's a really important point that, we're not going for 100% settlement rate. That'd be a problem with that, because I think you're going to be coercing some of those cases, and then those agreements are not going to be as resilient. I think studies have shown that, that those agreements that are sort of forced don't hold up as well. But also, sometimes people's best option is to go to court. Like, you're doing them a disservice by having them compromise. Like, sometimes they are better off going to court, so it's important to keep that in mind. And it's not even to determine that, but to sort of allow that to happen sometimes.
And just sitting in court one time, hearing the judge rule against a person who refused to, settle in mediation, and he says, "Is there an appeal?" And I heard the magistrate, of course there is, but I heard the magistrate said, "I told you the case was over." And he said, "Is there an appeal?" And she said, "Would you like to leave on your own, or would you like to be escorted out?" I should have settled in mediation. I would have gotten a much better deal. Well, thank you so much, Joe. We really appreciate it. Okay.
One more point. I have, in a number of instances, had more than one caucus for the same case. Progress that you make in one is probably baby steps. Before the end of the day, you need more than one caucus. So that's turned out to be a good way to settle.
Incrementally making progress.
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, while it's not to do with caucuses, the caucuses are not the product of which oftentimes comes of the case that's not successful. But I always try to make the point that this hearing, or this mediation session, is the small claims form of discovery, which makes you that much more aware of what both parties' positions are when you do go to trial.
And that's where Tom Truesdale used to say, when they come before him after mediation, if they come before him without mediation, they're this far apart.
Right.
If they come before him after mediation, they're this far apart. So it makes his job easier.
Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.